To survive the siege, they ate their horses, then their mules, and after 147 days, a British army surrendered anyway. This is Kut, 1916. April the 29th, 1916. In a small town inside a bend of the river Tigris, after 147 days under siege, a British army surrenders whole. More than 13,000 men of the British and Indian armies pass into Ottoman captivity. The largest surrender of a British army to that date, greater even than Yorktown, 135 years before. This is the story of Kut al-Amara, how an army marched up a river and why it could not march back. In November 1914, days after the Ottoman Empire entered the war, British and Indian troops landed at the head of the Persian Gulf. The mission was limited: protect the oil refinery at Abadan that fueled the Royal Navy and secure the port of Basra. This was Ottoman Mesopotamia, the provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul, the land between the rivers. But success invited appetite. Each victory left the next town on the Tigris within reach, and the next. London never quite ordered an advance on Baghdad, and never quite forbade one. So the force simply kept moving. An advance no one had ordered, up a single winding river that was also its only road, its only telegraph, and its only line of supply, a line that stretched thinner with every mile. There were no roads worth the name, so the army travelled on the river itself. Gunboats, paddle steamers, barges, and native craft in tow. Kurna fell in December 1914. In June 1915, Major General General Townshend pursued a broken Ottoman force up the Tigris with a flotilla of small boats, and Amara surrendered to a few dozen sailors arriving ahead of the army. In September, his 6th Division, the Poona Division, most of its infantry Indian sepoys, outflanked the trenches at Es-Shin and took the town of Kut al-Amara. Townshend himself doubted. His division was tired, and the sea was now more than 300 miles behind him. His chief, General Sir John Nixon, saw only the prize ahead, Baghdad. The advance went on. "16 miles short of Baghdad, beside the great brick arch of Ctesiphon, the Ottoman army turned and stood. Colonel Nureddin had spent weeks entrenching a double line astride the Tigris, and his force had grown to some 18,000 soldiers with over 50 guns. On November the 22nd, Townshend attacked with around 11,000. His troops carried the first line. The second did not break. For 3 days, the two armies fought each other to exhaustion. About 4,600 British and Indian casualties, 2 in 5 of Townshend's force, and at least 6,000 Ottoman. A tactical draw, a strategic defeat. It was Townshend who was hundreds of miles from the sea, and his army that limped back down the river toward Kut. On December the 3rd, the exhausted division marched into Kut al-Amara, a mud brick town packed inside a tight loop of the Tigris, water on 3 sides. Townshend chose to stop there, inside the bend, and his men dug a line across the open neck of the peninsula. Behind it stood roughly 13,000 troops and followers, and some 6,000 townspeople who were never evacuated. The pursuit arrived within days. Halil Pasha and the elderly German Field Marshal, Colmar von der Goltz, commanding the Ottoman 6th Army, threw a ring of trenches around the loop, stormed it 3 times at heavy cost, then stopped and let the river and the calendar do the work. By December the 7th, Kut was sealed. Relief, Townshend told his men, would come within weeks. The relief came up the Tigris in January and bled to death on its banks. Lieutenant General al-Amara's Tigris Corps attacked at Sheikh Sa'ad, then at the Wadi, then at the Hanna defile, a narrow corridor of dry ground between the flooded river and the Suwaikia marsh. Winter rain turned the plain to paste. There were too few doctors, and wounded men lay in the mud for days. At Hanna, on January the 21st, the leading brigades walked across 600 yards of open ground into entrenched rifles and machine guns, and lost 2,700 men in a single morning. 3 battles in 2 weeks cost nearly 9,000 British and Indian casualties. Ottoman losses were a fraction of that, and the corps stood still, miles short of Kut. Inside the loop, the siege became arithmetic. The bread ration fell from £1 a day to 10 ounces to 5. From late January, the garrison ate its horses and mules one by one. For months, many Indian sepoys, Hindu and Muslim, refused the meat on religious grounds, until dispensations came from their own faith leaders, and hunger left no argument. Scurvy and dysentery spread through the trenches. In April, aircraft began dropping food into the town. History's first major attempt to supply an army by air. It failed. The biplanes averaged little more than £1,000 a day, and some loads fell into the river or the Ottoman lines. The garrison needed £5,000 simply to stand still. The men grew too weak to dig, and the spring flood crept toward their trenches. On March the 8th, al-Amara tried the southern bank, a silent night march across the desert to surprise the Dujaila redoubt at dawn. The columns arrived on time, and then waited for their artillery program, by the book, while the trenches in front of them stood almost empty. The pause cost everything. Ottoman reserves crossed the river. The assault, when it finally went in, broke against a manned position, and around 3,500 men fell. al-Amara was dismissed. In April, his successor, Gorinj, ground up the left bank. Falahiyah fell, but Sanayat did not. Repeated assaults collapsed in the floodwater as the Tigris burst its banks, and the defenders cut the dikes, drowning the line of advance. After some 23,000 relief casualties in 4 months, there was no way through. One desperate card remained. On the night of April the 24th, the river steamer Julnar, plated with armor, stripped of everything spare, loaded with 270 tons of food, ran upriver for Kut with a volunteer crew of 15. Every Ottoman gun on the lower Tigris was waiting. 9 miles short of the town, at Magassis, she struck a steel cable stretched across the river and was shot to a standstill at point-blank range. Her captain, Lieutenant Furman, was killed. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Commander Cowley, died in Ottoman hands. Both received the Victoria Cross. In parallel, London had authorized secret talks. An offer of £1 million, then £2 million, carried by officers including the young Captain T. E. Lawrence for the garrison's release. Enver Pasha refused. There would be no ransom and no relief. On the morning of April the 29th, 1916, Townshend destroyed his guns, burned his codes, and surrendered unconditionally. More than 13,000 men passed into captivity, nearly 3,000 British, and over 10,000 Indian, soldiers and camp followers alike. Their fates divided at once. Townshend was taken to Constantinople and sat out the war in comfort in a villa on the Prince's Islands. His men were marched north through Baghdad and on across the desert toward Anatolia. Hundreds of miles on foot, with little food or water, the sick driven forward or left where they fell. How many died in captivity is still disputed. Estimates run from around 4,000 to nearly 5,000, more than the siege itself had killed. Von der Goltz saw none of it. He had died of typhus in Baghdad 10 days before the white flag went up. The Fall of Kut, what the historian Jan Morris later called the most abject capitulation in Britain's military history, forced a reckoning. The Mesopotamia Commission reported on the campaign in 1917, a war begun for oil and continued for prestige, run on the cheap, without transport, without hospitals, without a plan. One minister called the report simply the cemetery of reputations. The Secretary of State for India resigned. But the rebuilding had not waited for the verdict. Through 1916, Britain remade the front from the water up. Railways, hundreds of rivercraft, base hospitals, and gave General Maude a force of 150,000 men. Kut was retaken in February 1917. On March the 11th, Baghdad fell. What hubris had lost, logistics won back, at a price no one had intended to pay. In Turkey, the siege is remembered as Kut Zaferi, the victory of Kut, one of the last great triumphs of the Ottoman army, set beside Gallipoli, the Ottoman triumph of the year before. Halil Pasha later took Kut as his family name. In Britain and India, the memory is harder. A campaign of mission creep punished by geography, and a garrison that paid for decisions made hundreds of miles downstream, most of them with Indian lives. The military lesson outlived the empire that learned it. No army can outrun its supply line. And on the Tigris in 1916, the river was the supply line. The figures in this film are historians' estimates. In Mesopotamia, even the dead are still being counted.